June 14, 1943, Fort Benning, Georgia. The sun beat down mercilessly on the airfield as 28-year-old Technical Sergeant Francis Moretti watched the paratroopers of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment hobble toward the medical tents. Their faces contorted in pain as comrades helped them limp across the tarmac. Casualties not of enemy fire, but of their own landings. Moretti, assigned to document training jump injuries for the Quartermaster Corps, believed he was merely gathering statistics for equipment improvements that would take months, if not years, to implement. He had no idea that within 6 weeks, his chance encounter with a former Barber would save hundreds of American lives and revolutionize airborne operations. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the extraordinary tale of how one man's intimate knowledge of an entirely unrelated field would transform the most dangerous moment in a paratrooper's mission, and how the greatest innovations in wartime often come not from engineers or generals, but from ordinary men and women who see the world differently. The 5th Airborne Training Battalion had completed another day of qualifying jumps at Fort Benning. 18 paratroopers had sustained injuries requiring medical attention, 7 with sprained ankles, 4 with fractured fibulas, 3 with tibial fractures, 2 with compressed vertebrae, and 2 with concussions. Staff Sergeant Michael Dennison of Baker Company had broken his collarbone when his reserve parachute swung violently during landing. While not uncommon, the injury rate troubled Captain Howard Withers, who was tasked with preparing these men for combat jumps, where medical evacuation would be impossible. "These boys are landing too hard," Withers remarked to Moretti as they observed the training field. "They're doing everything by the book, but something about these T-7 chutes just punishes them on impact." Moretti nodded, jotting notes in his ledger. "I've got 3 months of data showing the same pattern. 23% injury rate across all training battalions. General Ridgway is pushing for modifications, but Washington says the production lines can't be disrupted while we're building up for the European invasion." The Type 7 parachute had been the standard issue for American airborne forces since 1941. Its design was remarkably effective in deploying reliably from aircraft traveling at 160 miles per hour, but its 28-foot canopy created a descent rate of nearly 21 feet per second, fast enough that even properly executed landing rolls frequently resulted in injuries. Captain Withers sighed and pointed toward a group of men practicing their landing falls on canvas mats nearby. "Look at Sergeant Galliano over there. He was a professional boxer before the war, best physical specimen in the regiment. Even he got banged up on his 4th jump yesterday." Moretti watched as Sergeant Anthony Galliano demonstrated the paratrooper landing fall, feet together, knees bent, body twisted to distribute the impact across calf, thigh, buttock, and back in a fluid rolling motion. His execution was flawless in practice, but Moretti had witnessed enough actual jumps to know that theory rarely survived contact with the ground at 20+ feet per second. "The problem isn't technique," said Moretti. "It's physics. We're asking men carrying 80 pounds of equipment to absorb the impact of falling from a second-story window. Some injuries are inevitable." What neither man realized at that moment was that a solution was already taking shape, not in the research laboratories of the Quartermaster Corps or the engineering departments of the Army Air Forces, but in the humble barracks of a former civilian barber who had been drafted into service just 6 months earlier. Private First Class Daniel Rossi had been cutting hair in his family's Brooklyn barbershop since he was 15 years old. At 34, he was considerably older than most of the new recruits when his draft notice arrived in December of 1942. His age and experience with precise handwork had landed him a position maintaining and repairing parachutes rather than jumping with them. A stroke of fortune that would ultimately benefit thousands. That evening, as Rossi sat on his bunk inspecting a damaged T-7 parachute, he noticed something about the suspension lines that connected the canopy to the harness. 28 lines, each made of nylon cord, converged into the 4 main risers that attached to the paratrooper's harness. The lines were evenly spaced around the canopy, creating a perfect, symmetrical descent. "That's the problem right there," Rossi muttered to himself, running his fingers along the cords. "Too perfect." His bunkmate, Private Joseph Klein, looked up from his letter writing. "What's eating you, Rossi?" "These chutes," Rossi replied. "They're designed to drop men straight down like rocks, but that's not how you want to hit the ground." Klein shrugged. "That's what the landing fall is for, isn't it?" Rossi shook his head. "I've been watching the landings from the repair tent. Even the best of them hit hard. What if we could give them a little forward motion? Spread the impact over time instead of all at once." The idea had been germinating in Rossi's mind for weeks. As a barber, he understood something about lines and tension that the engineers who designed the parachutes had overlooked. In his Brooklyn shop, Rossi had developed a technique he called the modified angular distribution approach to cutting hair, what his regular customers simply called his MAD technique. By adjusting the tension at different points, he could create subtle but significant changes in how hair lay across the scalp. "It's all about distribution," Rossi explained, warming to his subject. "When I cut hair, if I pull every strand with the same tension, I get an even but unnatural look. But if I vary the tension, a little tighter here, a little looser there, the hair falls more naturally, follows the contours of the head." Klein looked skeptical. "What's that got to do with paratroopers breaking their ankles?" Rossi grabbed his notepad and sketched quickly. "Look, these suspension lines are all the same length, creating a perfectly balanced canopy. What if we shortened some of them, just the ones in the front?" His sketch showed a parachute with a slight forward tilt, the front edge of the canopy lower than the back. "If we modify the front lines by about 3 inches, we create what barbers call a forward distribution, what I use for men with receding hairlines. The parachute would still descend at the same rate, but it would also move forward slightly. The trooper would land with some horizontal motion, turning some of that vertical energy into forward momentum." Klein's skepticism deepened. "You want to change the design of Army parachutes based on how you cut hair?" Rossi smiled. "Sounds crazy, doesn't it? But tension is tension, whether it's hair or nylon cord." The next morning, Rossi approached Master Sergeant William Thompson, head of the parachute maintenance section, with his idea. Thompson, a 20-year veteran who had seen countless improvement proposals come and go, was initially dismissive. "Private, do you know how many people have tried to improve the T-7? Engineers with degrees from MIT and Caltech have been working on this problem for years," Rossi persisted. "With respect, Sergeant, those engineers don't spend their days watching these things fail. I do. I repair the chutes after hard landings. I see the patterns." Thompson studied Rossi's sketch. A career soldier, Thompson had jumped with early versions of the T-7 and had himself suffered a compression fracture during a training jump in 1941. Something about Rossi's earnestness gave him pause. "You really think this haircutting business applies to parachutes?" "Tension distribution is a universal principle, Sergeant." "It doesn't care if it's hair or nylon," Thompson sighed. "Fine. Modify one chute, just one, and we'll test it on a dummy drop. But this stays between us until we see results. I'm not bringing some harebrained barber scheme to the colonel without proof." Over the next 3 days, Rossi carefully modified a standard T-7 parachute, shortening the forefront suspension lines by exactly 2 3/4 inches each. The alteration was barely visible to the casual observer, but would theoretically create a 7-degree forward tilt to the canopy during descent. On June 19th, a sunny Friday afternoon when most of the training staff was occupied with administrative duties, Thompson arranged for a test drop using a 170-pound sand dummy. Technical Sergeant Moretti, still gathering data on injury rates, was invited to observe. "What exactly am I looking at, Sergeant Thompson?" Moretti asked as they watched the C-47 aircraft approach the drop zone. "Probably nothing," Thompson replied. "But if Private Rossi is right, you'll see the difference in how it lands." The aircraft made its pass at 1,000 feet, and a single parachute emerged from the jump door, unfurling cleanly against the blue Georgia sky. As it descended, Moretti noticed something unusual. "That chute's moving forward," he observed, tracking its path with his binoculars. Thompson nodded. "That's the modification. Front suspension lines are shorter by about 3 inches. The parachute descended toward the drop zone at the standard rate, but with a noticeable forward glide that carried it approximately 30 feet horizontally for every 100 feet of vertical descent. When the dummy struck the ground, instead of the typical straight-down impact, it hit at an angle and rolled forward naturally. Moretti whistled softly. "That's different." The three men approached the impact site. The sand dummy, usually deeply embedded in the soft earth of the drop zone after a standard drop, had created a shallower depression and a short skid mark where it had rolled forward after impact. "Look at this," Thompson said, crouching to examine the ground. The impact force was distributed over about 3 feet, instead of concentrated in one spot. Moretti's analytical mind was already calculating. If this translates to human jumpers, we could be looking at a significant reduction in landing injuries. Rossi knelt and ran his hand along the skid mark. Just like when you cut with the grain instead of against it. Less resistance, smoother result. The three men exchanged looks, suddenly aware they might be onto something significant. But a dummy drop was one thing. Testing with live paratroopers would require official approval. Captain Howard Withers was skeptical when Thompson and Moretti approached him with Rossi's modification. The captain had seen too many improvements that created more problems than they solved. "Let me get this straight," Withers said, leaning back in his chair. "You want me to let my men jump with parachutes modified by a barber based on how he cuts hair?" Moretti placed his data ledger on the captain's desk. "The physics is sound, sir. We've done 3 more dummy drops since Friday. The modified chute consistently shows a 30% reduction in impact force based on ground impression measurements." Withers leafed through the data, his expression softening slightly. "Who came up with this again?" "Private First Class Daniel Rossi, sir," Thompson replied. "He's been with the parachute maintenance section for 5 months. Former civilian barber from Brooklyn." "A barber," Withers repeated, shaking his head. "And you're calling this what? The haircut modification?" Rossi, standing at attention beside Thompson, cleared his throat. "Modified angular distribution, sir. MAD for short." Withers couldn't suppress a smile. "Well, it is MAD." He closed the ledger. "All right, here's what we'll do. Modify 6 chutes, not 1 more, and I'll select 6 of my most experienced jumpers for a test. If they report improvement, we'll take this up the chain." On June 23rd, 6 veteran paratroopers of the 502nd made jumps with Rossi's modified chutes. All 6 reported noticeably smoother landings, and Staff Sergeant Galliano, the former boxer, was particularly enthusiastic. "It's like the difference between jumping off a wall and using a slide," he told Withers afterward. "You still hit the ground at the same speed, but you're moving with it instead of against it." Moretti meticulously documented the jumps, measuring landing patterns and recording jumper testimonials. The evidence was compelling enough that Withers authorized a larger test. 30 modified chutes for the next training jump of 1st Platoon, Company A. On June 27th, 30 paratroopers jumped with MAD modified chutes, while 30 jumped with standard T7s. The results were dramatic. The control group suffered 7 injuries requiring medical attention, a typical 23% injury rate. The test group experienced only 2 minor injuries, both from troopers who had failed to maintain proper body position during descent. Word began to spread through Fort Benning about the Barber chutes that were reducing injuries. Colonel Robert Sink, commander of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, requested a demonstration, sending his regimental surgeon to evaluate the medical implications. Major James Ewell, the surgeon, was initially doubtful. "The human body can only withstand certain forces," he told Moretti, before observing a test jump. "If these men are still hitting the ground at 20 feet per second, physics dictates similar injury patterns." But after watching several jumps with the modified chutes, Ewell's professional curiosity was piqued. "The landing pattern is demonstrably different," he noted. "The conventional vertical impact concentrates force on whatever body part hits first, usually feet, ankles, and lower legs. This horizontal component creates a rolling dissipation of energy." Ewell accompanied Moretti to the maintenance hangar, where Rossi was modifying additional chutes. The doctor peppered the former barber with questions about tension distribution and force vectors, apparently surprised by Rossi's intuitive understanding of principles he'd learned through decades of precise handwork, rather than formal education. "It's remarkable," Ewell told Colonel Sink afterward. By creating this forward slip, Rossi has essentially turned the human body into its own crumple zone, the same principle automobile manufacturers are exploring to make car crashes more survivable. Colonel Sink, impressed by both the concept and the results, brought the modification to the attention of Major General Matthew Ridgway, commanding general of the 82nd Airborne Division. Ridgway, preparing his division for the upcoming invasion of Sicily, immediately grasped the tactical significance. If this modification can reduce landing injuries by even 20%, that means more effective fighting strength the moment my men hit the ground, Ridgway said during a demonstration at Fort Bragg in early July. In the first hours of an airborne assault, every able-bodied rifleman makes a difference. Ridgway authorized immediate implementation of the May-D modification for the chutes of select Pathfinder teams scheduled to jump into Sicily. Meanwhile, Technical Sergeant Moretti was tasked with preparing a comprehensive report for the Quartermaster General, documenting the modification process and its results. Major General James Gavin, Assistant Division Commander of the 82nd Airborne and himself an enthusiastic jumper, insisted on personally testing the modified chute. "I've made 37 jumps with the standard T7, Gavin told Rossi, who had been flown to Fort Bragg to supervise the modifications. "I know exactly how it feels to land. Let's see if your Barber trick makes a difference." On July 7th, Gavin jumped from 1,000 feet with a Rossi-modified chute, executing a textbook landing that transitioned smoothly into a forward roll. The general's face broke into an uncharacteristic grin as he gathered his parachute. "Get every chute in the division modified," he ordered. Priority to the Pathfinders and first-wave jumpers. With the Sicily invasion imminent, parachute riggers worked around the clock to implement Rossi's modification. The process was remarkably simple, removing and shortening the front suspension lines by precisely 2 3/4 inches, then reattaching them to the canopy. An experienced rigger could modify 8 to 10 parachutes per day. On the night of July 9, 1943, the Pathfinders of the 82nd Airborne Division jumped into Sicily using MAD modified parachutes. Despite high winds that scattered the drop across miles of Sicilian countryside, the Pathfinder teams reported significantly fewer landing injuries than anticipated. Sergeant Frank Peterson of the 505th Parachute Infantry later described his landing. "We jumped into a 30-mile-per-hour headwind near Gela. With a standard chute, that kind of wind would have driven us straight down into the ground like a pile driver. But with the modified canopy, I actually glided into the wind, almost hovering before touching down, rolled forward about 10 feet, and came up ready to fight." As the main airborne assault commenced, the value of the modification became even clearer. Lieutenant Colonel Shields Warren Jr., surgeon of the 82nd Airborne Division, reported that landing injuries were approximately 60% lower than projected, based on previous airborne operations. In the field hospital, "We treated 67 fractures and sprains from landing impacts," Warren wrote in his after-action report. "Based on the total number of jumpers and our experience in training exercises, we would have expected approximately 170 such injuries. The reduction is statistically significant and tactically valuable." For Operation Avalanche, the airborne portion of the Allied invasion of mainland Italy in September 1943, all parachutes used by American airborne forces featured the Rossi modification. Post-operation medical reports confirmed a 70% reduction in landing injuries compared to previous operations using standard parachutes. Private First Class Daniel Rossi, the Brooklyn Barber whose understanding of tension distribution had revolutionized airborne operations, received the Legion of Merit, unusual recognition for a private, and was promoted to technical sergeant. He spent the remainder of the war training parachute riggers in his modification technique and working with engineers to incorporate the principle into new parachute designs. The story of the MAD modification spread through the airborne community, becoming part of paratrooper lore. General James Gavin later wrote in his memoirs, "In warfare, innovations often come from unexpected sources. Who would have thought that a barber's understanding of how hair falls across a man's head would save hundreds of paratroopers from injury?" Rossi's insight reminds us that expertise in one field can sometimes solve problems in another, completely unrelated arena. But beyond the tactical advantage of reduced injuries, the MAD modification had a profound psychological impact on the paratroopers themselves. Lieutenant Michael Collins of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment expressed this sentiment in a letter home after the Sicily jump. The most terrifying moment for any paratrooper isn't the jump itself. It's those last few seconds before you hit the ground. With our new chutes, there's a feeling of control, of working with gravity, rather than just being its victim. The men jump with more confidence now, knowing they're more likely to land ready to fight rather than being carried off on a stretcher. In warfare, confidence can make all the difference. The ripple effects of Rossi's innovation extended far beyond World War II. After the war, civilian parachute manufacturers adopted the principle for sport jumping, creating the first primitive steerable parachutes. By the 1950s, parachutes with modified suspension lines enabling forward movement became standard for military and civilian use alike. Daniel Rossi returned to his Brooklyn barbershop after the war, resuming his trade with little fanfare. For years, his regular customers remained unaware that their barber had revolutionized parachute design and saved hundreds of lives. Occasionally, former paratroopers would seek out his shop, wanting a haircut from the man whose barbering principles had given them a safer landing on distant battlefields. In 1955, during the 10th anniversary commemoration of the end of World War II, Technical Sergeant Francis Moretti, who had documented the original MAD modification tests, tracked down Rossi to inform him of the modification's lasting impact. "Your work directly saved at least 400 men from serious injury during combat jumps in the European theater alone," Moretti told him. The post-war steerable parachute designs all trace their lineage back to your barbershop insight. Rossi, by then in his mid-40s and balding himself, responded with characteristic humility. "I just noticed something that didn't look right and fixed it the way I knew how. Any barber worth his scissors would have done the same." The story of the MAD modification offers a powerful lesson about innovation in wartime. Sometimes the most effective solutions come not from advanced technology or specialized military knowledge, but from the application of everyday expertise to unexpected problems. Daniel Rossi's understanding of tension and distribution, developed through years of cutting hair in Brooklyn, proved more valuable in that specific moment than the combined efforts of engineers who had designed the parachutes in the first place. It also highlights the often overlooked role of skilled tradespeople in military innovation. While history typically celebrates the contributions of scientists, engineers, and military strategists, countless improvements to equipment and techniques came from enlisted personnel who brought civilian skills to their military service. Throughout World War II, former mechanics modified vehicle engines for better performance in desert conditions. Butchers improved field kitchen operations, carpenters enhanced fortification techniques, and countless other tradesmen applied their civilian knowledge to military challenges. The barber whose hair-cutting technique saved paratroopers was just one remarkable example of this broader pattern. For the paratroopers who jumped into combat with Rossi-modified chutes, the technical details mattered less than the practical result. As Sergeant Anthony Galliano put it after the war, "We didn't care why it worked. We just knew that landing didn't hurt as much, and we could get up fighting instead of nursing a sprained ankle. In combat, that's all that matters." The MAD parachute modification continued to evolve throughout the war. By the time of the D-Day invasion of Normandy in June 1944, parachute riggers had refined Rossi's technique, creating what they called MAD Plus, a variation that shortened the front suspension lines by 3 inches and lengthened the rear lines by 1 inch, creating an even more pronounced forward glide. General Maxwell Taylor, commander of the 101st Airborne Division, credited the modified chutes with significantly improving the combat effectiveness of his division in the critical early hours of the Normandy invasion. "Due to the wide dispersion of our drop, small groups of paratroopers found themselves isolated and outnumbered," Taylor reported. "The fact that 87% of our men were unhurt and combat effective upon landing, compared to barely 60% in previous operations, made all the difference in those first crucial hours." In the decades after the war, the principles behind Rossi's modification became foundational elements of modern parachute design. Today's ram air parachutes, with their fully steerable, wing-like canopies, represent the logical extension of the Brooklyn Barber's insight that paratroopers should land with the grain rather than against it. Perhaps the most fitting tribute to Rossi's contribution came in 1968. When retiring, General James Gavin presented him with a shadow box containing the shortened suspension lines from the parachute Gavin had personally used to test the modification 25 years earlier. "You might have been a barber by trade," Gavin told Rossi at the presentation, "but you understood something about falling bodies that all our engineers missed. Sometimes it takes someone from outside the system to see what those within cannot." Rossi continued cutting hair in Brooklyn until his retirement in 1976. He passed away in 1981, having lived long enough to see his improvised modification evolve into the fully controllable sport parachutes that made skydivers seem to float gracefully to earth rather than plummet. His obituary in the local Brooklyn paper mentioned his military service and the Legion of Merit, but not the specific reason he had received it. Like many of the greatest innovations in military history, Rossi's contribution had by then been absorbed into standard practice. The remarkable origins of the technique, forgotten by all but a few aging paratroopers, who remembered when landing hurt a lot more than it needed to. Technical Sergeant Francis Moretti, who had documented the original tests at Fort Benning, maintained a detailed record of the MAD modification's development and impact. After retiring from the Army in 1962, he donated his papers to the Airborne and Special Operations Museum in Fayetteville, North Carolina, ensuring that the story of the barber who revolutionized parachute landings would not be entirely lost to history. Today, modern military parachute systems bear little external resemblance to the modified T-7s used in World War II. Yet the fundamental principle that Daniel Rossi identified, that paratroopers should meet the ground at an angle rather than straight on, remains a cornerstone of parachute design philosophy. As one modern parachute instructor at Fort Benning puts it, "Every time I teach a new class of jumpers about controlling their canopies, I'm teaching them techniques that evolved from a Brooklyn barber's understanding of how hair falls across a scalp. It might be the strangest technology transfer in military history, but it saved countless lives and limbs." The story of Daniel Rossi reminds us that innovation rarely respects institutional boundaries or formal credentials. Sometimes, the most valuable insights come from unexpected sources. A barber noticing that parachutes, like hair, should fall naturally rather than being forced into position. In the high-stakes environment of wartime, the willingness of officers like Captain Withers, Colonel Sink, and Generals Ridgway and Gavin to consider an idea from a private with no engineering background reflected an institutional openness that contributed significantly to American military effectiveness. While military hierarchies are necessary for discipline and command, the best leaders recognize that good ideas can come from anywhere in the ranks. The next time you watch footage of paratroopers floating gracefully to earth, remember that their controlled descent owes something to a Brooklyn barber who saw connections between his trade and their needs. A man who understood that whether dealing with hair or parachutes, working with natural forces, produces better results than working against them. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.